Hello. I haven't done one of these in a while, but there were a few things that I wanted to talk about in relation to Sunday's sermon. So, welcome to Sermon Scraps for this week. Anytime I like reading through or talking about the Bible, there's probably something in there that's hotly debated or contested. One of the big things that came out as I was studying Sunday's passage was the debate about the way Pilate is demonstrated or talked about in Mark's gospel and well throughout all the gospels, but wondering if that is actually true to who he was. And if the Bible, everything and anything is debated. But people were wondering, like, it didn't seem like he would just give in or capitulate to people's wishes or like be easily swayed by people. And that's part of the reason I shared the stories that I did about him. And so it's interesting that we have all these at times skewed perspectives about how people are. And so I think it is interesting just looking at some of the ways, other stories that we have about Pilate and the way he engaged with them. And this like opportunistic idea, I think, is demonstrated even with some of the language that Pilate used in this text. So, like as he's engaging with the crowd, verse 9 he says, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" And then a little later on, verse 12, Pilate says, "What shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" So he is obviously pinning it on the crowd, the people who are calling for Jesus' crucifixion. Like he's just giving in to whatever it is that the crowd wants to do. So I just thought it was an interesting perspective and way as we like, because these stories are about real people, real historical events. They took place in human history, which we just have a tendency to miss because we're just looking at words on a page and are somewhat distanced from those stories themselves. So like some of the difficulty is just we're looking at 2,000 years of history, a different time, different culture, different expectations, different worldviews. All these different perspectives have shaped and influenced the way we have a tendency to interpret those texts today. The other thing I want to talk about is I was just thinking through, like, because I brought in some of the other accounts on Sunday. Like, just FYI, Mark is my least favorite of the four Gospels. John is actually my favorite just because it's the most theological. Mark is the briefest, like most succinct to the point. Most people think it was the first written gospel, and all the others borrowed from Mark for the stories that they put together. But part of the reason that we have four Gospels is because it was giving different people's perspectives on what happened. Like, think through like an event that you had in your growing up life. If you the way you tell the story is going to be very different than the way your parents would tell the story, which is going to be very different than if you have siblings, the way your siblings would tell the story. Like all of us interpret the events that are taking place through our own individual lenses. So like the discrepancies that people talk about in the comparison between the gospels somewhat gets down to just the way people remember the stories. It's also important for us to remember the gospels are the way history or stories or biographies were written in the first century were not the way we think of biographies today, and that like when we tell a story we try to go like this is the first thing that happened and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Gospels and biographies were written with a different purpose, that is to communicate a specific point about who God is. And so like the way the stories are in there are shuffled around all over the place. So the timing isn't the important part. The important part is the message that is being communicated through them. Another thing I wanted to point out, Sunday I talked about like some of the old textual manuscripts include in in Barabbas's name, they call him Jesus Barabbas. As so, Pilate is trying to make this intentional connection between which of these two Jesuses do you guys want to follow? Are you guys clamoring for? So then there's debate and discussion regarding which like why was his name Jesus? So like one of the arguments I read that it was taken out was because they're trying to lift high the true Jesus and say like there's no one like him, and that is true. But then some of what we see, like there are multiple textual variants that we need to work through. So just like an example of something like this, if you look at Mark 11 and in any good modern Bible, Mark 11 goes from verse 25 to 27. So I mean, there's been whole like conspiracy theories done around missing verses. That's not the only place. There's a couple other places in Mark's gospel. There's one coming up and later on in Mark that is supposedly missing. And some of the reason that we have this is because we have a wealth of textual manuscripts. So again, like thinking back to if your family tells a story to each other or engages, like everyone has their different perspective on it. Well, similarly with the way the Bible was transcribed down through the ages, there's people who were copying them made mistakes. But then the the way, like, so many people have made the example, or tried to bring the example of like the game telephone, where you whisper something in someone's ear, and then you go all the way around the circle of the people who are there. When it finally gets back to the main person, it's really funny because what the original person said isn't at all what the last person ends up hearing and then reciting. So there, the way the Bible is transcribed is people would literally copy it word for word. You'd have someone like looking down over you, like you'd have people making sure that everything you did was right. But in that copying, like, people are not perfect. So then there would be like things that would either slip in, or people would add notes or commentaries as they were writing some of the manuscripts that we have. And so then what part of what we have done today is just the Dead Sea Scrolls was revolutionary in biblical studies, just because it brought back a wealth of manuscript evidence for the Bible that we have. But then some of what we have is we can compare all these wide of thousands of manuscripts and compare and contrast and see, like, okay, most of them have this verse in, like three of them have this verse in, but the like thousands of others don't have that verse in. So should that verse stay or should that verse not stay? And then as it was translated from like Greek into Latin, from Latin into English, and going on from there, some of these additions, well, not even additions, but that point to like, as we've gotten better and older manuscript evidence, the most accurate, or like the oldest manuscripts that we have don't have them. So then as people like were transcribing these as it went down in history, like some of the verses that have been taken out are because they didn't show up until like 600 or 700 years later, after more manuscripts had been done. And some of this even gets to some of the way we believe that the Bible was delivered to us as humans. Like it wasn't delivered as like an edict from on high that just appeared suddenly in front of us. That's what Mormonism actually believes, that there were gold tablets that were given to Joseph Smith and then he just interpreted them. No, there are like some places, like think of the Ten Commandments, where God literally wrote on pieces of stone, or places in like Revelation where God tells John, write this down. There's the same thing with some of the prophets in the Old Testament. So that's not the by and large the way the Bible was written, though. It wasn't like God commanding someone to write something down, with some exceptions. It also wasn't hypnotism, like someone just became possessed or filled by the Holy Spirit and then they are like possessed, writing this thing down. Suddenly they open their eyes and there it is. It also wasn't just like manual transmission of like someone just writing exactly what God tells them. Like, what we believe God did is he used specific people, specific places, and specific situations to write out and write down the exact words that he wanted for his people through all time in human history. And so some of the reason I want to talk about this now is because we're going to get to some very debated texts in Mark 16 in just a couple weeks. So I wanted to share just a little bit about where the Bible that we had came from and where some of these debates are centered on, and then we'll talk a little bit more fully about that in a couple weeks when we get to Mark 16. With that said, I've got a few announcements just to remind us. Coming up on Sunday, we'll have our normal class. I'm finishing up my class on 50 core truths finally, over a year after we started. So this coming Sunday is the last one on the new heavens and the new earth. Even if you haven't come before, this would be a worthwhile study to come and participate in. But then Sunday night, we're having our prayer, praise, and pie night. I believe it's starting at 6:30, but check the Friday news flash for that. I also totally butchered the Christmas decorating. Date was wrong on the slide. So the Christmas decorating you're all invited to is going to be on December 1st. That's a Friday night. We're going to start at 6:15. We'll have some light snacks, refreshments, apple cider, hot chocolate. There will be opportunities for kids to decorate a tree down in the kids wing. We'll also have a Christmas movie playing for kids, but would love for you to come and participate in Christmasing the church together. And I think those are the two primary announcements. Don't forget, Christmas Eve service is going to be on Christmas Adam. That's December 23rd this year. So it's just kind of weird because Christmas Eve is on a Sunday, and we normally have worship service on Sunday morning. So we'll be having our Christmas Eve service at 4:30 on Saturday, December 23rd. Then we'll be having our normal worship service at 10:30 on Sunday, Christmas Eve. I think those are the big announcements. Don't forget to check the Friday news flash, and we look forward to continuing. Mark, we just have 2 weeks left, and we'll see you, Lord willing, on Sunday.